So what we have is an issue to deal with. When we click on our Create Activity button, we don't see any change. Our component at this stage has not unmounted. We've still got our activity form component open. And the only thing that's changed is the props that we're receiving here. And in fact, we're not even receiving props into this component. When this component loads, what we're doing is we're checking to see our parameter here. And if this exists, then we're loading our activity. And our activity remains inside our MobX activity store as the selected activity. So when we load this activity, what we're doing here is we're setting list.activity, and this remains in place. And what we should do after we unmount our component is clear this activity back to its original state, which is, in this case, it's undefined. So let's take a look at one of the features of useEffect that we haven't actually used yet. And what we can do inside our useEffect method is to clean things up when our component unmounts. Now, I mentioned earlier that this useEffect hook is equivalent to 3 different React component class lifecycle methods. It's equivalent to the component did mount, the component did update, and the component will unmount lifecycle methods. And let's just head briefly back to the documentation in React, and let's take a look at the hooks and take a look at using the effect hook. And if I just take a look at the docs, we've got the effects without cleanup, and that's what we've been using so far. And if I scroll a little bit further down, then we can see the effects with cleanup section. And in a React class, we would typically set up a subscription or something in the component did mount lifecycle method, and then clean it up in the component will unmount. And here's an example of how this system worked. We have these 2 lifecycle methods here, and the cleanup takes place in component will unmount. But we can do this all within the same React hook now. And if I scroll a bit further down, just for the example, then what we do inside our useEffect function is we have our initial side effect. We have our initial call. In our case, it's going to be out to our API or our load activity method. And then in order to clean up from this, what we do is we return a function from inside this useEffect hook. And then this will clean up anything afterwards. So we'll go back to our useEffect, and after our if statement, what I'm going to do is return, and this is just going to be a normal function. And what we want to do here is call a function that's going to clear our activity from our activity store. Now, we don't have such a function yet, and inside our activity store, I'm just going to add a new action below the load activity, and I'm going to say action clear activity. And all this is going to do is set list.activity to undefined, although I'd rather call this null. And I'm going to change the undefined in our activity from undefined to null. And initially we're going to set this to null as well. And this shouldn't cause any other issues inside our components, except it does inside these methods that again we're not using anymore, but just to get rid of the errors for now, I'm just going to set these to null as well. And this cleans up any problems. So this is what we're going to do when we clear an activity. So let's go back to our activity form, and in our unsubscribe methods, or what we're returning from this useEffect, we're just going to say clear activity. And I need to bring this in from, or add it to our destructured props and say clear activity. So now when we unmount our component, our activity in our store is going to be set to null. And I've just noticed here that I don't have any dependencies here, so this may cause problems by missing these off, because this is going to run every single time. So what we need to do is we need to add our dependencies. If we only ever want this to run once, remember, we need to add either an empty array. But because we're using these functions, we need to add these as dependencies to this particular method. So I'm going to add load activity and clear activity. And we're also going to need to add the match params.id as a dependency. So I'm going to add this. And we also need to add our initial form state here as well. And this should be correct. And if I go back and take a look, and if I click on refresh, then I get my activity. And if I click on create activity, it's made absolutely no difference. And the reason for this is that we haven't actually unmounted our components. But our component props have changed because when we click on the link to create an activity, and I've probably got loads of warnings in my logs, and we will clean these up very soon, but let's concentrate on getting this working first. And if I click on my components and I search for the activity form, and take a look at my props, and all I can see here is the router props. Our activity is not coming from our props, it's coming from our context. And unfortunately, these React development tools have not caught up with all of the latest features in React at the moment. So it's kind of difficult to really demonstrate what's going on. But just to give you an example of what we can use is the location object to identify when our props are being updated and we want to re-render our component, or reinitialize our component in this case. And if I click on back in my browser, we can see that the location path name changes, and we've got this location key that changes as well. And if I click on create activity, then we can see this also updates as well. So let's head back to the React documentation, because what we want to do is take a look at the API reference. And first of all, we'll take a look at the component reference for states and lifecycle. And what we want to look at is the detailed component API reference. And in the lifecycle methods, the way that we used to do this to get around when something was receiving new props and we wanted to reset some states was we used to use this component will receive props method, and then we would be able to compare the previous props with the current props, and we could make a decision about resetting certain states. Now, this is marked as unsafe and deprecated, but it does give me a link to where I want to look at inside here. And what we want to do is look at the alternatives to using component will receive props. And the circumstance that I want to talk about is if we used component will receive props to reset some state when a prop changes, consider either making a component fully controlled or fully uncontrolled with a key instead. Now, fully controlled means that we effectively remove state from our components. Now, we can't do that because we're using a form and we have to manage the state inside our component. But what we could use is this fully uncontrolled component with a key. And what we can do is add a key, and we have a key that we just looked at, which was the location key, to something, so that when we re-render our component, or when we change a prop in our routes, then our component reinitializes. And what this effectively does, when the key changes, React will create a new component instance rather than update the current one. And keys are normally used for lists, but are also useful here. And just to point out, in case you're concerned about the performance impact of a new component instance rather than an update, they do accommodate this, and they do suggest that the performance difference is insignificant. So what we'll do is we'll make use of a key, and we'll make use of this location key, and we'll put it on our route that's controlling the create activity and the manage activity. So let's head back to VS Code. And what we want to do is we want to go to our app component, and we effectively want to add a key to this particular route so that when the props change inside this route, it creates a new instance of whichever component it's loading here, and it's going to be our activity form, of course. So we can add a key, and if I try and add a key here and say location.key, then I'm going to fall victim to a type error because we don't have access to location at the moment. Even though this is controlling all of our routes, we don't actually have any route properties available inside our app components. Now what we can utilize to give our app components some properties is we can use a with_router higher order component that's available from React Router DOM. So I'm just going to bring in with_router, and what this is going to do, because it's a higher order component, it's going to take our app components as a parameter and then return a new app component with routing properties that we'll have access to. So I'm going to say with_router and then surround the observer and the app, and now our app component will have access to the location properties. But what we'll also do is need to make them available and pass them in as a type parameter to our app component. So we'll make this a React functional component type, and we'll pass in our root component props that we did previously, and all we need to get from this is the location prop, and then we can use location on our routes. So we can give it a key, and we can say location.key, and now whenever the location key changes, which it does when we navigate to creating an activity or managing an activity, then this component is going to reinitialize. So let's make sure this works, and I'll just go back into the browser. I'll click on activities, click on view an activity, click on edit, and now if I click on create an activity, we can see that the component resets itself. And just to make sure it works when I just refresh the page as well, and I'll refresh this activity, click on create an activity, and boom, we now have a blank activity form. Excellent. So what we also want to do is make sure that we can still submit our forms, and if I just make a change here and click submit, it seems to have worked, but I haven't been redirected back to the activity details page, and my change has persisted. But what I want to do is obviously make sure that I redirect back to the activity details page after I submit my changes, and we'll take a look at that next.